So we've come to the end of the Second World War. Let's talk about what happens after that war concludes. What organizations are formed? What does the post-war world look like? This is Chapter 29, Section 5. Our objectives for this chapter: describe the issues faced by the Allies after World War II ended. Summarize the organization of the United Nations. The League of Nations was not successful, so what about the United Nations makes it likely to be more successful? We will analyze how new conflicts develop among the former Allies after World War II. Our focus question: what issues arose in the aftermath of World War II, and how did these new tensions develop? Just as World War I was a devastating war, World War II was even more devastating. As many as 50 million people died in the war, military and civilian, and after the war ended, the Allies faced many difficult decisions about how the post-war world would look and how they would be able to rebuild. A new international organization was formed, the United Nations, as both a peacekeeping and a humanitarian group. Economic assistance was offered via the U.S. Marshall Plan, which offered aid to those countries that were in desperate need of resources to rebuild. And the Soviet Union, former ally, and the West quickly developed competing alliances, and this becomes the beginning of what unfolds as the Cold War. Let's take a look at the estimates of the casualties in World War II, and as I mentioned, they were absolutely devastating. You'll see in this chart, among the military dead, clearly the Soviet Union paid the greatest price, with Germany and the Axis powers behind with 3.5 million. Military wounded, likewise, the Soviet Union paid the greatest price, and even civilian dead. Look at that number, 15 million civilian dead in the Soviet Union. But across the board, casualties and deaths were extremely high. It was a devastating war. During the war, the Allied powers were aware of many of Hitler's concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps, but it wasn't until the end of the war that the extent of these camps and the extent of the Holocaust was made clear. General Dwight Eisenhower actually went to visit the camps, and he was stunned by what he saw. His quote is, "He came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard in every sense of decency." The Allies put on trial several of the leaders of the Axis powers at Nuremberg, and several of these were convicted and ultimately put to death for their war crimes. Hitler clearly was not put on trial, as he had committed suicide as the Soviets and the Allies converged on Berlin. In the end, nearly 200 Germans and Austrians were tried. Most of them were found guilty. The Allies made efforts to establish new democratic governments in Germany and also in occupied Japan, and they intended these governments to be able to promote peace and tolerance. In Japan, General MacArthur played a significant role in the creation of a new constitution for that country, and in this case it gave power to the Japanese people rather than where it had been with the emperor and those in the military. In 1945, Germany, Japan, China, the Soviet Union, and other countries were literally devastated. Here you see a picture of a German town, and you can clearly see the devastation of the buildings. Cities, factories for production, harbors, bridges, and railroads had been destroyed in all the bombing. In addition to those casualties and deaths, we had 20 million refugees who wandered around Europe with no homes. And try for a moment to put yourself in the place of someone who might have lived in these cities. even maybe someone who was a refugee. Hunger was an issue. There wasn't any great means of producing food. Disease, sanitation was an issue. Mental illness was a problem. We've talked before about post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD, and how so many of our soldiers return from Iraq and Afghanistan with PTSD. Well, many in the civilian population, in addition to the military, whose homes and cities had been bombed for days, weeks, months, and even years, may be left with no home, but they're also dealing with these mental issues as a result of this. Clearly, the Allies needed to help these devastated countries. These countries, specifically here referring to Germany, Japan, China to some extent, and the Soviet Union, but also Britain and France. The United States, who again came out of this World War in a pretty strong position. We've talked about the industrial capacity of the United States and how strong the economy was by the end of the war. Well, the United States stepped in to help relieve the post-war hunger and poverty specifically in Western Europe. And the vehicle by which this program and this assistance was delivered was called the Marshall Plan. It was named after the Secretary of State, George Marshall, and it was aimed to provide food and economic assistance to rebuild these countries in Europe, not just the winners, but also the losers. Interestingly, this aid, these programs to rebuild the countries, were also offered to Stalin and the Soviet Union and those Eastern European countries that were under Stalin's control. And Stalin himself refused the aid from the West, and he also forbade those Eastern European countries from accepting the aid. So we start to see the beginnings of this divide between the Allies and Stalin's desire to maintain control and go in his own direction. In April of 1945, delegates from 50 nations met to form a United Nations Charter. So this was another attempt to form an international organization of which countries would be a member that was designed to maintain a peace going forward. We had tried it once with the League of Nations. This was another attempt to do that. Note the date of April 1945. So this was in the works even before the war in the Pacific had finished. In the United Nations, the General Assembly, at least the greater body, each nation would have one vote in that General Assembly body. However, there would be a smaller body called the Security Council, and in that Security Council you would have permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China, and you would have, for different intervals, other members of that Security Council. Those 5 permanent members of the Security Council would also have the right to veto any council decision. The idea was to give these great powers the authority to ensure the peace. The Security Council had the power to apply economic sanctions, and we've certainly seen that done in places like Iraq, Iran, and Korea, just to cite a few examples. They can also send a peacekeeping military force, which is something that the League of Nations was not able or willing to do. Now, in practical terms, this veto power from these permanent members, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union, has many times kept the United Nations from action. But regardless, the United Nations has been fairly successful and even goes beyond the idea of simple peacekeeping. It's taken on many of the world's problems, including education, protection of refugees, and economic development in the first, second, and third world. Some of the agencies that fall under the United Nations umbrella you've probably heard of: the World Health Organization and another, the Food and Agricultural Organization, have helped millions. In the aftermath of World War II, we have a new power structure in the world. We have 2 new world superpowers, that being the United States and the Soviet Union. At this point, the United States has clearly abandoned its traditional policy of isolation. President Truman at this point saw communism and the Soviet Union as a threat, and that, among other things, made the plans for world peace a very rocky road. Differences between the West and the East grew among the Allies. The conflicting ideologies between the West and the East, which we've talked about before, and this continued mutual distrust led to a situation that we deem the Cold War. And it's considered the Cold War because it's not necessarily direct armed conflict between the rivals. It's described as a state of tension and hostility between nations allied with the United States on one side and those allied with the Soviet Union on the other. This rift between Stalin and Western Allied leaders grew in the 1940s. Remember, Stalin had promised in the post-war world to give those countries of Eastern Europe self-determination, and at this point he declined to do so. What Stalin wanted, as we mentioned before, was to have a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Germany to protect itself from any future invasions from Germany. So Stalin pretty much stuck with that approach and very strongly dominated those governments in Eastern Europe, and they ended up being very pro-Soviet communist governments. Meanwhile, new conflicts begin to develop outside of Eastern Europe. Stalin was stirring the waters in Greece and Turkey, and also in another area that we've talked about, the Dardanelles. And Stalin backed communist rebels in each of these countries. The United States, again, clearly not in our isolationist mode from before the war, and primarily in response to the fear of the spread of communism, developed a policy called the Truman Doctrine, obviously named after Harry Truman. This idea is to limit communism to the areas where it already exists, those areas under Soviet control, and do whatever we can in terms of resources and other support for governments to resist the spread of communism. As a result, under the Truman Doctrine, the United States sent military and economic aid to advisors in both Greece and Turkey so that they would be able to withstand what we saw as the threat of communism. Germany, again, became a focus of the Cold War and the changing world in the post-World War II timeframe. Remember, we had mentioned that there was an agreement at Yalta between the Allies that in the post-German surrender, each of the Allies would receive a zone that would, in Germany, that would help transition them to a post-war government and a post-war economy. Likewise, within the city of Berlin, it also, being the capital, was divided up into these zones, one for the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Britain. The intention clearly is to eventually, as occupying troops leave, allow these regions to come together into one Germany. The Soviet Union, however, had different plans. The Soviet Union, in their zones of occupation, took reparations for its massive war losses, and also, in very practical terms, dismantled and moved factories from Germany back to the Soviet Union to help rebuild the Soviet Union. In the end, the Western Allies decided that they would combine their zones together, and with the help of the Marshall Plan, they would pour resources into what became known as Western Germany to help rebuild that part of the country. The Soviets were furious at the moves by the Western Allies and made efforts to even strengthen their control on Eastern Germany. The next move was Stalin's move, and in June of 1948, in an effort to drive the Western powers out of Berlin, now if you remember back to that map, Berlin actually falls within the Soviet zone of control, so that's why it was divided even though it fell within the Soviet zone. In an effort to keep the Western powers out of Berlin, or to drive them out of Berlin, Stalin made an effort to block delivery of all supplies, food, rebuilding supplies, machine parts, to the parts of the city that they controlled. But in the end, Stalin's attempt to block any land delivery of supplies to West Berlin failed because of what became known as the Berlin Airlift. So for more than a year, round the clock, night and day, the Allies delivered all the supplies required to both live and rebuild in Western Berlin via the air. Eventually, Stalin was forced to give up his blockade, and this sort of small victory was a sign to an indication to the West of how willing they were to stand up to Stalin, and in this battle at least, the West prevailed. So the Berlin Airlift remains one of the great successes of the early Cold War period. Coming out of the war, we have a new series of alliances, just as we talked about in World War I. On the west, we have 12 countries, including the United States, and those nations of Western Europe. They get together to form an alliance called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And basically this organization is an agreement for all of those nations to come to the defense of any single one of those nations that might come under attack, primarily from those countries in Eastern Europe and under the domination of the Soviet Union. The Soviets, in response, formed their own military alliance, this time called the Warsaw Pact, with the Soviet Union and those satellite countries in Eastern Europe that were under Soviet communist control. As a result of these alliances, the tensions between the West and the East continued to grow. Both sides participated in extensive propaganda wars and sought to extend their world power and their influence in other parts of the world. And we'll talk more about that going forward. All right, let's take a look at our definitions, our terms and people. Nuremberg, the city in Germany where we held the Nazi war crime trials. Ironically, that same location where Hitler would hold many of his Nazi party rallies that were so well documented in footage that we've seen here in this class in the past. The United Nations, formed in 1945, a body of nations designed to promote world peace. The Cold War, a state of tension and hostility between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. Interestingly, it rarely resulted in direct armed conflict, but did many times, as we'll talk about, result in indirect armed conflict or proxy wars. The Truman Doctrine. It's the policy of limiting communism to the areas that are already under Soviet control and providing aid and military assistance and advice to those countries that seek to resist the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan, and this one is very key. It's a massive aid package from the United States designed to funnel food and economic assistance to those devastated countries in Europe to let them rebuild after World War II. Remember, this was offered both to the West and to the Soviet Union and those satellite countries under their control. Stalin denied or rejected any aid and did not allow those Eastern European countries to accept that aid either, but it was instrumental in rebuilding the economies, especially of Germany, but also of France and Britain. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the military alliance between several North Atlantic states designed to protect them from what was a presumed threat from the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc. The response in the East, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's military alliance with 7 satellite nations in Eastern Europe.